Yeah, we're hearing good. Just before I make a quick introductory remark or two, you need to be in a place sitting where you can see the slide presentation on these two walls. So I just want to make sure you're all good. If there's banners in the way, just make sure you can see. Welcome. This is an exciting evening. It's a significant day for me and for all of us. 30 years ago today, the Cincinnati Reds won Game 2 of the 1990 World Series, beating the Oakland A's 5-4 on their way to an unexpected 4-game sweep. Ha ha ha, a few of you laughed. So I'm John Franke, theologian in residence at Second Presbyterian here, and also a big Reds fan. But seriously, more significant is this is the first time that we have had an in-person adult formation event since March 11th of this year, which is 7 months and a week, which is, So I am excited and wanted to see this happen in person, and am hoping that it is moving into more opportunity for this. We're going to have to see how that goes. But in any case, I'm really excited that you're here tonight. Well, we haven't been meeting in person. I want you to know, if you don't, that we have been very busy in adult formation, and I would invite you to check out the Adult Ministries link on the Second Presbyterian Church website, and you will see an array of educational and spiritual formation opportunities that have been recorded. You could use them for groups, Bible studies. We've got a thing on what Presbyterians believe, Lectio Divina opportunities, so lots of things, so check out the website. One thing I want to mention in particular is this week we have launched a new Bible study on Isaiah. Isaiah's light in the darkness, faith when hope feels heavy, which I think is really appropriate for the times. And so you can check that out. There'll be a new video posted every week along with discussion questions, great for a small group. Great for individual studies, maybe a family gathering. You can do it at your own pace. You can start when you want. So that's a really important opportunity. Tonight, we are gathered for a special event to talk about politics. And I don't know how many of you hear this, but I hear this a lot, something like this. But John, Christians aren't supposed to do that. Politics is a worldly thing. We're supposed to be about spiritual stuff. Lots of people think that. People in our congregation think that. And in a way, I can understand it, because there have been Christian traditions throughout history, and especially in North America, that have said things very much like that. But here's what I want you to know tonight as we lean into this subject. That mindset has never been our Presbyterian and Reformed tradition. In fact, quite the opposite. In getting ready for this, I came across a quote from John McNeill, who you may not know, but is probably the preeminent Calvin scholar of the latter half of the 20th century. He's the one who edited the Institutes of the Christian Religion. That's the standard version. He wrote a very important article way back in 1964 on Calvin's view of civil government, and here is his conclusion. No responsible Christian can be without concern for civil government. Political indifference on the part of Christians is not a mark of superior piety, but of defective ethics, unquote. That's our tradition. Our tradition says we engage in these issues, but the big questions before us, especially in times of division, is how to do that faithfully. How to do that in ways that are reflective of our commitments to the gospel, and as a congregation that seeks to be a welcoming community of faith where Jesus Christ transforms lives. And I can't think of a better person to have with us tonight to talk about faithful politics than our own senior pastor, Chris Henry. So Chris, welcome. It's great to have you. To have a round of applause.
Well, it is I who should be applauding you. It's Saturday night, and you're at church. So thank you for taking the time to be here. And we are also recording this evening's presentation. And so I say that for two reasons. One, because I want you to know that you will have access to this in future times and places. And two, specifically regarding the presentation, the slides on the sides of the sanctuary here, to let you know that you'll have access to those, so a better way to see those, but I will read them because I know they're not entirely visible to all of us. You know, 2020 has been deeply challenging on so many different fronts and in so many different ways for people of faith. And I have used a couple of times the phrase that one of the gifts of this time is that crisis brings clarity, or crisis brings focus. We've spent a lot of time as a staff leadership team and as a session asking ourselves and talking about the questions around what is the unique role of the church, and then specifically Second Presbyterian Church in this time. So if we're seeking clarity, if we're looking for ways that we can really focus on the role of the church, what is uniquely ours to do and to be in this time? As I think about that, both in terms of the broader church and Second Presbyterian Church, I think nights like this evening offer us the opportunity to really go deep on one of the things that Second can uniquely offer our community and indeed the wider world. And that is an opportunity to think faithfully about some of the things that are dividing us or that we are struggling with as a broader world and nation. And so we do that in a lot of different ways. We do that through small group study. We do that in worship. We do that through Bible study. We do that with reading books together in small groups. Hopefully we do that in informal conversations. But my hope this week and next is to maybe take a step back and just offer some information that I hope will be helpful to all of us as we navigate these turbulent waters that are the fall of 2020, particularly around how Christians engage the political process. So, on that point, in case you've been vacationing on one of those planets that have recently been determined habitable by NASA scientists, it's election season in the United States of America. Indeed, we are in the thick of a bitter, heated, chaotic presidential campaign that sadly both reflects and intensifies our already deeply divided and polarized political climate. As sad as it is, I think this political cartoon might indicate one way to think about that. So you have identical kingdoms on two opposite sides of a narrow strait. And on one side of the kingdom is our blessed homeland, where our glorious leader, our great religion, our noble populace, and our heroic adventurers come from. And just on the other side of that narrow strait, we find their brutish invaders, their backward savages, their primitive superstition, and their wicked despot. Indeed, it seems as if in the fall of 2020, it's not enough for the quote-unquote other side to be wrong. They must be barbaric. They must be brutish. They must be backward. They must be wicked. The rhetoric of our time is deeply, and for many of us, sadly, nasty. And much of what we hear from news outlets either confirms our deepest fears or drives our greatest frustrations. More on that a little later this evening and next week as well. But I will ask this to those in the room, and for those of you who are watching this via video, you can think of this question for yourself. But I wonder how many of you have a friend or a family member or a colleague with whom you are not able to talk politics this time every 4 years, or particularly this October. Raise your hand if there is someone in your life. Now, I want it known by those who are watching on video that I think almost every hand in the room has gone up, and certainly mine is up as well. Now, think about that. Think about that. folks we care about, folks we perhaps even love, folks we spend a lot of time with who know a lot about us and us about them, whom we are not able to even approach this subject with. I grieve this reality, not only as a citizen and hopefully an engaged one, but as a person of Christian faith, as a person who was taught in a church not unlike this one from an early age to see the image of God in those whom I encounter, to look for the good in all. Indeed, to me, this state of affairs offers a commentary, not just on our politicians and their campaigns, but on the role of our faith communities and the ministry of our church. So the next 2 Saturday nights, we're going to violate 2 of the basic rules of polite conversation. We're going to talk about politics and religion. Don't try this at your Thanksgiving tables. As we do, I want to be abundantly clear and right up front with 2 very important observations. The first is that we, Second Presbyterian Church, are a politically diverse community. This is not an unfortunate reality to be tolerated, but I believe a gift to be celebrated. It also means that there is someone in this very room who will vote differently from you on November 3rd for some position somewhere on the ballot. I guarantee it. There is someone somewhere in this room who feels as strongly as you do about some issue and feels that exactly in the opposite way. Our identity as a Christian community is precisely that, Christian. And I find that at places like Second Church, we are united by our faith in Jesus Christ and by very little else. The second observation is that this time and space is not a debate about who is right on policy positions. What we'll be talking about this week and next is how we function, how we engage the political process as followers of Jesus. So it's not my intention to give talking points on issues, and I won't be asking for your arguments on hot topics. We'll save that for another time and place. Most of us are well informed, and our perspectives are clear and deeply held, but those facts alone don't seem to be helping us create a civil or constructive dialogue. To this point, I'm sharing a quote from the Trappist monk and theologian Thomas Merton. In his book of letters titled The Hidden Ground of Love, here's what he writes on the screen now. Our basic problem is not political, it is apolitical and human. One of the most important things to do is to keep cutting deliberately through political lines and barriers and emphasizing the fact that these are largely fabrications, that there is another dimension, a genuine reality, totally opposed to the fictions of politics. That is the human dimension, which politics pretend to arrogate entirely to themselves. This is the necessary first step along the way toward the perhaps impossible task of purifying, humanizing, and somehow illuminating politics themselves. Now, Merton is not entirely hopeful. He says that task is perhaps impossible, and yet I believe it is precisely what we are called to do, to cut deliberately through these barriers, to emphasize the human dimension of our politics and therefore to purify and humanize them. That first step, that cutting through political lines, is what we'll be about these next 2 weeks. This evening, I'll structure the presentation around 5 temptations to avoid. That is, things to stay away from. Surely you could think of 5 more by the time the night is over, but I have the microphone and I've been thinking about this, and so I'll name my 5. Next Saturday, we'll shift gears a bit and we'll try to build a constructive approach to faithful citizenship. We'll do that based on 5 key virtues that seem lacking in our politics these days. We'll try to build a politics of character ethics after some of my mentors in the theological world. So this week, 5 temptations to avoid. Next week, 5 virtues to cultivate. So first, the temptations. Temptation number 1 is ignoring politics altogether. Occasionally, and seemingly more often in recent years, I'll hear someone say something like, quote, "I've just stopped paying attention to politics. I've just stopped watching the news. I can't handle it anymore." Now, I can understand. And probably all of us gathered here or watching this presentation can relate to this at some level. Indeed, there is too much of a not very good thing, and sometimes we get in over our heads. We need to unplug, get away, take a break, turn down the volume. It can be difficult to stomach the harsh words and insult-driven nature of politics these days. In fact, there is a long, storied history in the Christian church of struggling with precisely this question, whether it is the call of the Christian, the call of the believer to participate and or be a part of the political process at any level or not. It really goes all the way back to Jesus himself, who was approached by a group of Herodians and Pharisees. 2 groups of people who would have found themselves on literal opposite sides of the political spectrum. The Herodians, devotees to the ruler of the time. That's how they got their name. Herod's followers, the Herodians on one side, and the Pharisees, those religious zealots who mostly kept their noses out of the political world. And the group joins together to ask Jesus a question. And do you remember what that question is? It's a question about taxation. Is it lawful for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Of course, the answer Jesus gave doesn't help us very much, except as a reminder to be discerning in how we approach politics as people of faith. Give Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. Give God what belongs to God. There are many ways this answer has been interpreted through the generations, but I think we can at least agree on this much. Pay attention, Jesus says. Pay close attention to which of those realities gets your greatest allegiance. In the year 426, St. Augustine published The City of God. In the book, he argued that there are 2 distinct realities in which all believers, all followers of Jesus live. There is a city of God and a city of man. And theologians for centuries have been debating what exactly this means. Some have suggested and continue to suggest that it means that followers of Jesus are called to live entirely, or at least as much as possible, in the city of God, to remove themselves from the city where humankind is in charge and spend as much time as they can meditating on the things of God, the sacred and the holy, to remove themselves. My parents grew up among the Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and that's one example of a Christian community that has sought to live as much as possible in the city of God, taking the scripture, "Come apart and be ye separate," as their creed. But this is not St. Augustine's conclusion. And as John Frankie has already shared, it is certainly not in keeping with Reformed or Presbyterian theology. While there may be two cities or two kingdoms, to use Martin Luther's language, Reformed Christians are called to live in both, to do so simultaneously. This is not easy. This can be painful. This can call those allegiances into question. But our call is indeed to engage as God's people in the real world, not retreat or ignore. One of the reasons why this is so important for Reformed Christians is because we understand that the people who are in our churches are exactly like the people who we encounter in the grocery store and whose names appear on the ballot. They are beloved children of God and fallen sinners depraved in their sinfulness. That is to say, we can't come into the church to get away from the brokenness of the world, because as soon as we come into the church, the brokenness of the world has come into the church. And the reverse is also true, and in fact more deeply so. That when we go out into the world, we do not leave the sacredness of God's presence. Indeed, the world that God loves, the world that is the arena of God's grace, the world is God's home. As the book of Revelation reminds us, see, the home of God is among mortals. God lives here. Over its centuries of existence, the Presbyterian Church in this country has sought different ways to make this mainstay of the Reformed tradition known to its members. I particularly like a statement from the Presbyterian Church U.S., that's the old Southern Presbyterian Church, sorry about that, titled "The Theological Basis for Christian Social Action," and I'll read it to you. "If we bear witness and serve the Lord, then as a church and as individuals, we have a clear responsibility to concern ourselves with the social and political sphere also. To say nothing and to do nothing in this sphere is to deny our own gospel. It is to say that there are at least some areas in the world and in our own lives where God is not Lord." Now here, before we leave this first temptation behind, I want to emphasize that there is an important difference, at least in my mind, between Christianizing American politics and bearing witness to the gospel in the way we engage the political systems. But to avoid politics completely is, I think, to abdicate our responsibility as citizens of this earthly kingdom and as followers of Jesus Christ, called to live our faith as he did in the world. Scripture and our heritage suggest that this is the most faithful way to live, as Christ lived in the world. So once we've dismissed this first temptation, we can get on to the more interesting ones. And the second temptation that I've named is to conflate people and their perspectives. I think this temptation is closely tied and related to the first one in at least one key way. And that is that when people describe to me why they have stopped paying attention to the political world or watching or listening to the news, the reason often has to do with their desire to remain friends with those people we talked about earlier, whose viewpoint they deplore. The dangerous temptation at play here is to assume that we can only like or love those with whom we agree. The polarization of our politics, the clustering of like-minded groups, the echo chambers of our social media existences have made this conflation more common in our time and place, perhaps than ever before. One writer calls this moral tribalism and finds it in increasingly statistically demonstrable ways. That shift is not only expressed through surveys and opinions. Certain demographic indicators of tribalism have increased steadily and then exponentially. People are likelier to live around people who share their political beliefs, more likely to interact with those who share their convictions, and yes, more and more likely to worship and belong to a congregation with those who share their political point of view. When I knew it was time for me to seek a new congregational call and began the process of discernment about what kind of church God might be calling me to serve next, one thing I was very clear about was that part of my call is to serve a congregation of diverse political persuasion, where the broad spectrum of political viewpoints is represented. I did not feel called to this kind of context because it's easy, but rather because I think it is part of how we demonstrate the kingdom of God to the world, one of those great ends of the church. I find that across the American Christian landscape, increasingly, there are two kinds of congregations. There are those that might be called litmus test churches, churches where the political filters exist at the door or at the point of membership, and you already know when you sit down to worship or after having heard a sermon or two or had a conversation or two, you already know that 99% of the congregation holds one political position or another. The second kind of congregation is that might be called a politically diverse community that never wants to talk about anything that might bring those divisions to the surface. This will always be a temptation for a, quote, big tent congregation to leave the difficult conversations behind, to tout our unity while avoiding topics that might call it into question. And so the church is always in danger of either reflecting the polarization of our time or avoiding those weighty conversations. I've said before that my call to second was cemented in a conversation with Dr. Enright in my first visit to Indianapolis when he said, Second Presbyterian Church strives to be a public church. One of the obligations of a public church is to have those conversations. Not that put our unity to the test, but that explore our ideological diversity in meaningful and transformative ways. That's the hard work of avoiding this temptation to conflate people and their perspectives. Once again, some of the most striking evidence of a shift in this polarized climate comes from marriage statistics. There's a researcher named Shanto Iyengar who is a political scientist at Stanford, and he studies political polarization. He describes this particular shift as dramatic. That in the 1960s and 70s, something like 2/3 of married couples came from the same political party. He points out that if marriages were totally random, 50% would be between people of similar political affiliations, so 2/3 is certainly higher than random. Today, however, that number is over 90%. Similarly, a 1960 survey found that around 5% of partisans would be upset if their son or daughter married someone of a different political party, 5%. In fact, Iyengar says they really dismissed the question as irrelevant. A recent poll asking the same question found that nearly half of partisans would be somewhat or very upset if their child married someone from the other political party. In fact, in his research, he's found that people with a partisan affiliation will even discriminate against people of another party when asked to review hypothetical scholarship applications or play basic trust games with another person. But this year, the realities of this polarization have become even more daunting. This headline appeared recently: Americans increasingly believe violence is justified if the other side wins. I'll read the bullet points. Among Americans who identify as Democrat or Republican, 1 in 3 now believe that violence could be justified to advance their party's political goals. In September, 44% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats said there would be at least a little justification for violence if the other party's nominee wins the election. And altogether, about 1 in 5 Americans with a strong political affiliation say they are quite willing to endorse violence if the other party wins the presidency. Within the church, this simply cannot be an accepted norm or practice. Why not? Because every single person we encounter is a child of God. Every person we encounter offers an invitation to model God's grace. By separating people from perspectives, we do not downplay significant disagreement or lessen our own deeply held convictions. I think that's the trick. But what we do is fulfill the call to love our neighbors, regardless of who they are. A quick word here about the value of real community. Let's see. As opposed to virtual community created by social media. This grumpy old guy says, "Your relentless posts on Facebook have not changed my political views. It has, however, completely changed how I feel about you." When people are most connected by means of technology, we are often reduced to our positions and our posts. Actual, real-life community goes beyond that shallow connection to deepen our understanding of each other. Our understanding of each other. Understanding is the key word here. There is a difference between understanding and agreement. There's a difference between the people we love and the point of view we hold. Rick Warren at Saddleback Church has said our culture has accepted 2 huge lies. The first is that if you disagree with someone, you must hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe or do. Both are nonsense. You don't have to compromise convictions to be compassionate. Or perhaps more simply put, we don't have to agree on anything to be kind to one another. Separating people and perspectives is that second temptation to avoid. Or conflating people and perspectives is what we want to avoid. The third temptation I want to name this evening is an idolatry of ideology. So John Calvin, our theological founder of our tradition, Reformed tradition, wrote that the human mind is a perpetual factory of idols. That is, that whenever one is exposed, we humans are really good at making up the next one. We can create idols with enviable speed. We seem to have unlimited capacity to manufacture golden calves, false gods. Simply put, we create an idol when we ascribe attributes or place hope in persons or things that should belong only to God. And I think we'd find very little debate by making the observation that one of the chief idols of our time is political ideology. I mean that in two ways. First, I think we look to political ideology as a means of salvation, when this should never be the purpose of our politics. No political ideology should seek to offer answers to what Paul Tillich described as questions of ultimate concern. We should not derive our deepest sense of meaning or significance from any political perspective, no matter how deeply held. That's not the intent or design. And because ideology is not God, making this assumption will fail us every single time, fall short of our expectations and hopes. Second, and related to the second temptation about people and perspectives, ideology becomes idol when we make it the center of our own identity. So the first is sort of casting our ideology as a God to save us, that if only we have all the right politics in place, salvation will be the result. And the second is turning that same idea to ourselves and identifying ourselves primarily or perhaps even entirely by our political identity. Jonathan Haidt in 2012 wrote a book I strongly recommend. The book's titled The Righteous Mind. He's a social psychologist. And he wrote, once people join a political team, they get ensnared in its moral matrix. They see confirmation of that grand narrative everywhere. And it's difficult, perhaps impossible, to convince them that they are wrong if you argue from outside of their matrix. Think about that. Once you've accepted this grand narrative, you find signs of its truth everywhere you go. Your open-mindedness is replaced by what Haidt calls the righteous mind. The mind that already knows what's right and finds confirmation of that. For Haidt, political affiliation is linked to deeper worldviews that make citizens resistant to the ideas of others. And Haidt also sees a recent shift to a more righteous and tribal mentality within American politics. So I wonder if in our own reflections we could take some time this week to consider where we might be making an idol out of idolatry, where we might be ascribing salvific power to politics, where we might be seeking an already determined truth everywhere we look. A few years ago, I read a column titled The Political Magic of C.S. Lewis. Now, you don't think of C.S. Lewis as a political thinker, but the column is fascinating, and I'll actually return to it next week. But one of the clear points it makes has to do with the danger of this idolatry of ideology and how deeply Lewis understood this danger. The author describes how much C.S. Lewis detested the idea of a Christian political party. He said it was blasphemy. He wrote, quote, "The demon inherent in every party is at all times ready to disguise himself as the Holy Spirit. The formation of a Christian party means handing over to him the most efficient makeup we can find." Jim Wallace has been a champion of Christian critique of both parties and really of all perspectives. Lewis writes, "Left and right are political categories, not religious ones. Attempting to mold faith to fit those labels distorts its meaning and power. The purpose of the religious right to identify faith with one political party was a blatant act of idolatry from its inception. And when religious left tries to create a mirror image, it makes the same theological mistake. Rather than becoming faux chaplains, enablers of political idolatry, the faith community should confront it." That is, that idolatry. Wallace wrote, "We who call ourselves followers of the one God should be raising our voices in defense of the people and principles that are essential to our faith and our true worship of that one God." Now, next week, I want to return to this when we talk about those virtues that we want to cultivate, because I find that one of the most important virtues to cultivate in avoiding this idolatry is the capacity for self-criticism, sometimes called humility. We'll return to that next week. The fourth temptation, and here, that I want to name this evening is letting fear conquer love. It's become somewhat commonplace and completely understandable to describe politics these days as fear-based. And from a political standpoint, this tends to be a successful strategy. It's also worth noting that this is not a new reality in the United States. Some of you might remember this, and hold on just one sec here. Can you still see the same thing? Yes? Okay. See if you recall this.
One, two, three, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
One interesting thing about that ad is that he quotes the poet W.H. Auden at the end, President Johnson does, in saying, "We must love one another or die." So within that very ad, you have this interplay between fear and love, and those clearly are the two motivators of humankind. We are motivated by fear and we are motivated by love. Now, at the time, this ad in 1964 was roundly criticized as sort of playing too heavily into the fears of Americans. Right now, watching it probably feels a little tame compared to a lot of what we see. So why a politics of fear? Quite simply because fear is a powerful human motivator. When we are afraid, we are easier to control, to mold, to fashion, to direct than when we are not afraid. I find that the voice of fear has been particularly strong this year, with lots of language about doom and destruction. For us, for we who are Christians, even in the grip of fear, we have a deeper call. We are called to love. And Scripture tells us that perfect love casts out fear. Scripture tells us that where there is love, there is no fear. So this week, as you're considering those idols that you have created out of political ideology or point of view, I wonder if you would also take a little time to consider the fears that control you, the fears that animate you, that motivate you, and how you are called to love through those fears. There's a particular fear that I think we should name and confront in this particular election cycle. It is the fear of the other, which is being used to motivate. The nature of our public discourse is a very important test for the moral health of a nation. The civility of that public discourse and debate should be a central concern for Christians, not just the what, but the how. The kinds of people who are denigrated is a critical concern. How one treats an opponent is indicative of both the public and personal character of political leaders. People of faith, in my view, have a God-given call to pay attention to how the other is treated. After all, we are the ones who are called to welcome the stranger, to care for the most vulnerable, to lift up the downtrodden. If the first will be last and the last will be first, we have an obligation to keep our eyes, our hearts, our minds on those who are last, those left out, left behind. When we allow fear to define how we view one another, we deny ourselves the fullness of joy, and we deny others the fullness of life. After taking up some very specific worldly concerns in his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul turns to the topic of spiritual gifts, particularly how spiritual gifts are used or demonstrated in worship. He ends the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians on that note about spiritual gifts, and then he nods at the end of the chapter toward the next topic. And here's how he does that. He writes, "I will show you a still more excellent way." And so Paul begins his greatest chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. "For if I speak in the tongues of angels and of mortals, but have not love, I am nothing." What is love? Love is patient, kind, not boastful, arrogant, rude, resentful. Love does not insist on its own way, but seeks the good of all. It seems to me that at times the desire to find common ground, as important as that is, should give way for Christians to the desire to find the higher ground. For that higher ground is where God's people have always found God. And it might be that we can meet in the middle on that higher ground. John Danforth has an interesting distinction in that he was for 2 decades a senator from the state of Missouri, but he also happens to be an Episcopal priest. And a couple of years ago, he gave a lecture to the Council of Episcopal Bishops. That's Episcopal bishops from all over the country. And I love what he said to them. He said, and this is on the screen, "For us, religion should be inclusive, and it should seek to bridge the differences that separate people. We do not exclude from worship those whose opinions differ from ours. Following a Lord who sat at the table with tax collectors and sinners, we welcome to the Lord's table all who would come. Following a Lord who cited love of God and love of neighbor as encompassing all the commandments, we reject a political agenda that displaces that love. Christians who hold these convictions ought to add their clear voice of moderation to the debate on religion in politics." So we seek to avoid letting our fears conquer our call to love, as challenging as that may be. And finally, for this evening, temptation number 5. Surrendering to despair. Perhaps you've seen this particular political ad this year. Giant Meteor 2020 just ended already. Now that's what the politics of despair looks like. It's good for a laugh, but for people of faith, it also does tell, I think, an important story. Somewhere between 62 and 75%, depending on which poll you trust, between 62 and 75% of Americans feel that our country is on the wrong track. Interestingly, that number, that right track, wrong track number, does not show nearly the amount of flux in political party that most polls do. In other words, a majority of our country, a clear majority, thinks we're moving in the wrong direction. This obviously should be a concern for us, not just because we're people of faith, but because we care about the common good and the purpose of the political system. Now, I've already made the case against burying our heads in the sand and forgetting about it, which there's one way to think about this surrendering to despair as that. Too much is at stake for us to do that. But we are also called, I think, beyond the politics of despair to a deeper place of hope. And here's where I think we, people of faith, might have a distinctive contribution to make to the conversation. We maintain hope, and we live out of a sense of abiding hope, not because our politicians are so capable, or because our ideas are all the right ones. We maintain hope because we believe that God holds our future and the future of the world. Again, we do not look to the political realm for ultimate salvation. We already know the source of that. In the final analysis, despair is atheistic. It is overly confident in human ability. Indeed, you might say, Calvin certainly would say, that in our depravity lies our hope. For, get this, we cannot fully destroy the future because we are simply not that powerful. Despair is atheistic, overly confident in human power, yet we do have power. My preferred Christian ethicist of the last century is Reinhold Niebuhr, who wrote at great length about how Christians must both use the power they have and confess the sin that comes with using that power. He called it Christian realism. The idea that abdicating our power is no more pure or innocent than using it for some mixed purpose. We do have power. And that power compels us to act in ways that bring hope to others, especially those who need it most. I was driving down 86th Street headed west on Thursday afternoon, and I was stopped at the stoplight right in front of Brebeuf, the school there at 86th Street. And I guess I had seen the sign before, but for some reason on Thursday afternoon it just sort of sang out to me, and it was the motto of the school: men and women for others. It seems to me that that's how Christians are called to embody their theology in political practice, to be for others. That power that we hold compels us to act. We do not surrender to despair because God is God, but we also do not surrender to despair because somebody else somewhere depends on our words and our actions to demonstrate to them that hope is alive. And there is a virtuous cycle to those words and actions that demonstrate hope, because those same words and actions will form us more deeply into people of hope. As one of my teachers, Stanley Hauerwas, used to say, if you want to become a person of prayer, start praying. If you want to become a person of hope, start hoping. Whenever someone reaches out to me in despair about the current state of reality, either in their own lives or in the world around them, I make two gentle pastoral suggestions. The first is to pray. The second is to do something for somebody else. This, I believe, can lift us from despair to hope. John Frankie mentioned McNeil as perhaps the greatest Calvinist of the last half century, but I would say that Marilyn Robinson is the greatest Calvinist writing today. And Robinson wrote just last week these words, which I used to close the evening. She wrote, "There is much to be done, more than inevitably limited people can see at a given moment. But the other side of our limitation is the fact that it carries with it a promise that we still might see a new birth of freedom and another one beyond that. Democracy is the great instrument of human advancement. We have no right to fail it." Next week we'll spend some time on those virtues that might shape our engagement in the political system and therefore the systems of which we are a part. Thank you so much for being here. Good night.